6 years ago, my mother told me I wasn't welcome at Thanksgiving anymore, because I didn't have a real career. No calls. No invitations. Erased from every holiday photo since. Last Tuesday, that same mother called demanding I hand over $1 million for my nephew's tuition. The woman who shut me out for 6 straight years. I stood in my kitchen in Austin, phone shaking, reading her text. You owe this family. You know what you have to do. What she didn't know was the envelope already sitting on my counter. The one that would change everything she thought she knew about me. This sounds like your family, hit like right now, because what happens next will leave you speechless. My name is Rachel Bennett, and this is the story of how getting banned from holiday dinners for having no career ended with me holding my entire family's future in my hands. Have you ever been the child your family decided wasn't worth the seat at the table? Not because you did something wrong, but because you didn't turn out the way they'd planned? For 6 years I told myself it didn't matter. That I'd built a life good enough not to need their approval. But when I saw my mother's name light up my phone that Tuesday, my hands went cold before I even read the message. Because she didn't call to apologize. She didn't call to see how I was doing after 6 years of silence. She called because she needed something. $1 million wired within the month, or my nephew would lose his spot at the university she'd bragged about to every relative who'd once looked down on me. The same university I could have attended myself, if she hadn't spent my senior year telling me I wasn't cut out for that world. If you've ever had a family member show up only when they need something from you, hit that like button right now. Because what's in that envelope on my counter is about to make her regret ever dialing my number. Growing up in Dayton, Ohio, there were 2 kinds of children in the Bennett family. The ones who followed the plan and me. My sister Megan followed the plan. Nursing school on time, on budget, paid for in full by my parents. $38,000 across 4 years. Receipts my mother kept in a folder she called investments. When Megan graduated, my parents rented out the community center. 92 people came. My father gave a toast that lasted 11 minutes. I didn't follow the plan. At 19, I dropped out of a business program my mother had picked for me and started building a small online consulting business out of my dorm room. Client by client, invoice by invoice, some months barely covering rent. My mother called it playing pretend. My father just went quiet whenever I brought it up, the same way he went quiet about everything that made her uncomfortable. For the next several years the message never changed. At Easter when I was 22, my mother introduced me to a family friend as the one who's still figuring things out, while Megan stood next to her in scrubs, glowing. At my cousin's wedding, I wasn't seated at the family table. I was placed with the co-workers 2 tables back, next to people I'd never met. By the time I turned 26, I had 23 active clients and had just signed a contract worth more than my sister's annual salary. I didn't tell them. I'd learned by then that good news from me only got reframed. Must be nice to not have real responsibilities, was my mother's favorite line, delivered with a smile so no one else at the table would think anything was wrong. I kept showing up anyway. 6 Thanksgivings. 5 Christmases. 2 Easters I drove 4 hours for, just to sit at the edge of a conversation that never once asked what I actually did for a living. I brought gifts every year. Thoughtful ones, expensive ones, the kind you buy when you're still hoping to be let back in. Half of them, I found out later, were re-gifted before the year was out. My father never once defended me. Not when my mother mocked my little laptop business in front of my grandmother. Not when she introduced Megan's fiancé to relatives before she'd even told them I existed. He'd just refill his drink and change the subject, the same way he'd been doing since I was a teenager. I used to think his silence meant neutral. It took me years to understand that silence was a choice too. The dollar amount my parents spent getting Megan through nursing school, $38,000. Was a number I knew by heart because my mother brought it up constantly, usually as a comparison. We invested in her, she'd say. We're still waiting to see what you turn into. What none of them knew was that by 27 my business wasn't small anymore. I had a 2-bedroom office in Austin. I had a business partner. I had a number in my bank account that would have silenced that entire dinner table if I'd said it out loud. But I didn't say it. I'd learned that whatever I built, they'd find a way to make it sound like luck or nothing at all. Then came the Thanksgiving I turned 28, the one where I found out exactly how little room they'd ever actually made for me. I still remember the exact words my mother said when I walked through that door. And I remember almost as clearly the sound of it closing behind me for what I thought was the last time. I remember the smell of the house first. Cinnamon. Turkey. My mother's candles, the ones she only lit for company. I remember setting down the pie I'd made, pecan, my grandmother's recipe, on the counter next to 3 others that looked exactly like it. I remember Megan's fiancé Tyler shaking my hand and asking what I did for work. I remember starting to answer. I remember my mother cutting in before I finished the sentence. She does some kind of internet thing, she said, waving her hand like she was swatting a fly. We don't really understand it either. A few people laughed. Not unkindly. Just the easy laugh of people repeating a joke they'd heard before. I let it go. I always let it go. Dinner started. 12 people around a table built for 10, extra chairs pulled from the garage. I sat where I always sat, the far end near the kids' table, close enough to hear the real conversation but never quite part of it. Halfway through the meal, my father stood up to make a toast. He talked about Megan's new job at the hospital. He talked about Tyler's promotion. He talked about how proud he was of the kids who worked hard and built something real. He didn't look at me once. I told myself it wasn't personal. I told myself that every year. Then my mother stood up next to him, wine glass in hand, and said the thing that ended 6 years of pretending it wasn't. We're just grateful, she said, that at least some of our children turned into something we can be proud of. The table went quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then someone laughed, Aunt Carol, I think, assuming it was a joke. It wasn't a joke. My mother wasn't even looking at Megan when she said it. She was looking at me. I put my fork down. I didn't say anything right away. I'd spent 28 years learning how to swallow things like this. But something in me had finally run out of room. Say that again, I said. Not loud. Just clear enough that the table went silent for real this time. My mother's smile didn't move. I said, we're proud of our children who built something real. I don't see what's controversial about that. I built a company, I said. I employ 11 people. I made more last year than Dad made in his best year at the plant. Nobody said anything. Tyler looked at his plate. Megan looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time in a decade. My mother laughed, a short, sharp sound with no warmth in it. Don't be dramatic. Nobody needs the theatrics tonight. I'm not being dramatic, I said. I'm telling you the truth because apparently you've never once bothered to ask. This is not the time, my father said quietly, not looking up from his plate. It's never the time, I said. It hasn't been the time for 6 years. My mother set her glass down harder than she needed to. If you're going to make a scene, maybe you shouldn't be here. I looked around the table. At Megan, silent. At my father, silent. At every relative who had spent a decade laughing along whenever my mother needed a punchline. You're right, I said, standing up. Maybe I shouldn't. I walked to the door. My mother didn't stop me. Nobody did. Don't bother coming back for Christmas either, she called after me, if this is how you're going to act. I turned around one last time. Don't worry, I said. I won't. I got in my car. I sat in the driveway for 11 minutes before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to drive. I didn't cry until I hit the highway. What I didn't know that night, what none of us knew, was that this wasn't the end of anything. It was the beginning of the 6 years that would completely rewrite who held the power in that family. And it would start with a decision I made 3 weeks later, one my mother wouldn't find out about for a very long time. 3 weeks after that Thanksgiving, I filed paperwork to formally incorporate my business as an LLC. Not because anything dramatic happened, because I finally let myself take it seriously. I stopped calling it my little thing. I started calling it what it was, Bennett Digital Strategy. The first year alone, I went from 11 clients to 31. I hired a part-time assistant, then a full-time one. I moved out of my apartment and into a small 2-bedroom office space in East Austin, the kind with exposed brick and a landlord who didn't ask questions about how new the business was. I worked Saturdays. I worked most Sundays. I ate dinner at my desk more nights than I'd like to admit. I didn't call my parents. Not once. Not on my birthday, not on theirs, not when Megan got married 8 months later. I found out through a cousin's Instagram post 3 days after the fact. By year 2, revenue hit $410,000. By year 3, it crossed $1.2 million. I signed my first 6-figure retainer client, a regional healthcare network, and hired my first director of operations, a woman named Priya who'd later become my closest friend and eventually my business partner. Somewhere in there I met David. He was finishing his residency at a hospital across town, the kind of quiet, steady person who asked about my work like it actually mattered to him. We got married in a small ceremony 18 months later. 40 guests, no Bennetts among them. My mother wasn't invited. I didn't debate it for long. By year 4, the agency crossed $3.4 million in annual revenue. We moved into a full office suite downtown. I hired 12 people. I stopped checking my bank balance out of anxiety and started checking it out of curiosity. That was also the year I did something I never told anyone outside David and Priya. I set up a private scholarship fund through my alma mater's business school, the same program my mother had once called a waste of a good tuition check when I'd first enrolled. I funded it anonymously. $50,000 a year, earmarked for first-generation students who didn't have family backing them. It felt like closing a loop nobody else knew existed. By year 5, the agency had grown enough that a private equity group approached us about a partial buyout. I didn't sell, not yet, but the valuation conversation alone told me something I'd suspected for a while. I wasn't just doing fine. I had built something my parents wouldn't have believed if I'd shown them the numbers myself. I still thought about that Thanksgiving sometimes. Not with the sharp ache it used to carry. More like an old scar you forget about until it catches on something. I'd built an entire life my mother knew nothing about. A husband. A home. A company with my name on the door. And for 6 years, none of it had touched her world at all. Or so I thought. It was Priya who noticed it first in March of year 6. She forwarded me a LinkedIn notification with a single line. "Isn't this your mom?" I opened it. A profile view. Then another 2 days later. Then a follow request from an account with my mother's photo, no bio, 12 connections. All of them people from Dayton I hadn't spoken to in years. I didn't accept it. I didn't think much of it either. People look up old family sometimes. It didn't mean anything. Then in April my cousin Ashley texted me out of nowhere. We hadn't spoken since the wedding I wasn't invited to. "Random," she wrote, "but your mom asked me last week if you were still doing the online business thing. He seemed weird about it. Just thought you should know." I stared at that message longer than I want to admit. Weird about it. I didn't respond to Ashley that night. I didn't know yet what weird about it meant or why, after 6 years of silence, my mother had suddenly started asking questions about a life she'd spent a decade dismissing. I found out 3 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon in May, when my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in 6 years, and I realized my mother wasn't just curious. She needed something. And she had no idea how much had changed since she told me not to bother coming back. The call came on a Tuesday, a little after 2 in the afternoon. I was in a client meeting when I saw the name flash across my phone. Mom. A contact I hadn't deleted in 6 years, mostly out of stubbornness. I let it go to voicemail. She called again 4 minutes later. Then a third time. By the fourth call, Priya was giving me a look across the conference table that said, "You need to deal with this." I stepped into the hallway and answered. "Rachel." Her voice was warm. Too warm. The kind of warm she used to reserve for company. "It's been a long time. 6 years, I said. I know. I know it has. A pause long enough that I almost thought she'd hang up. I've been thinking about you a lot lately. About us. About how things ended. I didn't say anything. I'd learned, over 6 years, that silence was the only language my mother actually listened to. I was hoping we could talk, she said. In person. It's important. Against every instinct I had, I agreed to meet her that Friday at a coffee shop halfway between Austin and the small airport she'd flown into. I told myself it was closure. I told myself I was curious. I didn't fully admit, even to myself, that some small part of me still wanted her to apologize. He didn't. She was already seated when I walked in. Hair done, blazer pressed, a leather folder on the table in front of her like she was walking into a business meeting. She stood, hugged me stiffly and started talking before I'd even sat down. Megan's son Caleb got into Whitfield University, she said. Early admission. Full acceptance letter came in March. That's great, I said carefully. It is great. It's an incredible school. She opened the folder. Inside were printed pages, tuition breakdowns, a payment schedule, a letter from the financial aid office. The problem is the cost. Whitfield doesn't offer much aid, and with the loan rates right now, Megan and Tyler simply can't cover it. Not without help. Okay, I said slowly. And you're telling me this because? She looked up at me, and for the first time in the conversation, her expression shifted into something almost businesslike. Because the total across 4 years comes to just under $1 million. And you're the only one in this family in a position to help. I sat there for a moment, genuinely unsure I'd heard her correctly. You want me, I said, to pay $1 million for Caleb's tuition. I want you to consider it, she said like she was correcting a minor detail. You have the internet business. Priya told Ashley you'd expanded. We know you're doing well. You don't know anything about what I'm doing, I said. You haven't asked me a single question about my life in 6 years. Her jaw tightened just slightly. That's not fair, Rachel. You're the one who walked out. You told me not to come back. That was a difficult night for everyone. People say things. She waved a hand, the exact same gesture from that Thanksgiving, like she was swatting away 6 years the same way she'd once swatted away my entire career. This isn't about that. This is about family. About doing right by your nephew who's never done anything to you. I almost laughed. Almost. You didn't come here to reconcile, I said. You came here because you need money and you remembered I might have some. That's an ugly way to put it. Is it inaccurate? She didn't answer that. Instead, she slid the folder another inch toward me. You know what you have to do. You have the means. This is your nephew's future we're talking about. Don't let old grudges cost that boy his education. I looked down at the folder. At the neat printed numbers. At a woman who had spent a decade telling anyone who'd listen that I wasn't cut out for that world. Now asking that same internet business to hand over 7 figures without a single question about how I'd built it, what it had cost me, or what 6 years of silence had actually meant on my end. I need to think about it, I said, which wasn't entirely true. I already knew what I was going to do. I just wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, not until I'd made one phone call first. I left the coffee shop, sat in my car in the parking lot and called Priya. How'd it go? She asked. She wants $1 million, I said. For Caleb's tuition. There was a pause on the line. Are you going to give it to her? I looked out the windshield at the folder sitting on my passenger seat where I'd left it, at the tuition numbers my mother had printed and highlighted like a sales pitch. No, I said. But I am going to help. What does that mean? I smiled for the first time all day. It means I'm finally going to open that envelope David's lawyer sent me last month. The one about the trust. Priya went quiet for a second. Rachel, what's in that envelope? I looked at the folder again, at my mother's neat, confident handwriting on the cover page. For Rachel, regarding Caleb's future. Something, I said, that's about to change every assumption my mother has ever made about who actually has the power in this family. The envelope had been sitting on my kitchen counter for 3 weeks. I finally opened it that night. Inside was a letter from David's family attorney. His grandmother, Eleanor, had passed the year before and left behind an education trust, one she'd quietly funded for over a decade, tied to a single condition. It could only be activated by a trustee she named herself. David hadn't wanted to push me to open it before I was ready. Eleanor had named me. The trust wasn't just money. It was a seat, an actual voting position on the scholarship committee at Whitfield University, the same school that had just accepted Caleb. I called the financial aid office the next morning, not as Rachel Bennett, estranged daughter, but as Rachel Bennett, trustee. Within a week, I had access to something my mother clearly hadn't bothered to check: Whitfield's own aid records. Caleb qualified for a merit-based scholarship covering 60% of tuition. It had been sitting in his file unclaimed since acceptance. Nobody had filed the paperwork. I also found something else. Priya, digging through old group texts Ashley had forwarded months earlier, found a message thread from my mother to my Aunt Carol, dated 2 weeks before that coffee shop meeting. Rachel's the only one with real money now. If she says no, we'll say she's punishing Caleb. She won't want that on her conscience. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a plan. I didn't call my mother to confront her. I let the institution do it instead. I had Whitfield's financial aid office send an official letter directly to Megan and Tyler, notifying them of Caleb's existing scholarship eligibility and outlining a manageable payment plan for the remainder. No loans required, no family contribution needed at all. I copied no one. I made no calls. I let the paperwork speak. 3 days later my phone rang. My mother again. "You went around me," she said before I'd even said hello. "You went to the school directly. Do you have any idea how that looks?" "It looks like Caleb doesn't need $1 million from me," I said. "He needed someone to actually read his file." "That's not the point. You told Aunt Carol I'd say yes because I wouldn't want it on my conscience," I said. "I have the message, Mom. Priya found it 3 weeks ago." Silence. Real silence this time, not the performative kind she used at dinner tables. "You were never going to ask me how I was doing," I said. "You were never going to ask about David or the company, or the 6 years you spent telling everyone I wasn't cut out for that world. You saw a number and decided I owed you access to it. I'm your mother." "You were," I said. "For 28 years you were. And I spent every one of them trying to earn a seat at a table you'd already decided I didn't belong at." She didn't have a response for that. For the first time in my life, my mother had nothing to say. "Caleb's tuition is handled," I said. "Not because you asked. Because I checked and he earned it and nobody bothered to look. That's the last thing I'm doing for this family until someone in it decides to actually see me." I hung up before she could answer. 2 days later, David's lawyer confirmed the trust was fully activated in my name. Not just the Whitfield seat, but a standing scholarship fund of $1.2 million, structured to go directly to first-generation students Eleanor had spent her life quietly rooting for. Students like the one I used to be, sitting at the edge of a table that never made room for her. I signed the paperwork on a Thursday afternoon, in an office with my name on the door, in a life my mother had spent 6 years insisting I'd never build. It's been 4 months since that phone call. My mother hasn't reached out again, and for the first time in my life, that silence doesn't hurt the way it used to. Caleb texts me sometimes now, small things mostly. A photo of his dorm room. A question about internships. He doesn't know all of it yet, but he knows I'm the aunt who showed up when it mattered, not the one who wrote a check to keep the peace. I still think about that Thanksgiving sometimes. The pie nobody remembered was mine. My father's toast that never once mentioned my name. The sound of that door closing behind me. For years I thought walking out of that house meant I'd lost something. I understand now that it was the first time I ever chose myself. Here's what I've learned. The people who only show up when they need something were never really at your table to begin with. Family isn't a debt you pay off by staying quiet and small enough not to embarrass anyone. It's earned the same way everything else worth having is earned, through actually showing up, actually asking, actually seeing the person in front of you. I didn't give my mother $1 million. I gave my nephew an actual chance on my own terms, and I gave myself something I'd been chasing since I was 22. Proof that I never needed their approval to be worth something. If you've ever been the one written off by your own family, the practical one, the difficult one, the one who wasn't cut out for it, I want you to comment the word "seen" right now. Because somewhere in this comment section, someone needs to know they're not the only one who had to build their whole life outside a door that never should have closed on them. If this story hit home, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And I'll see you in the next one.